So I thought I'd start with some broader digital identity network and ecosystem concepts. This is one way to evaluate digital identity networks and how we help our customers think about implementing digital ID. This is based on some work we've recently published with the DIAC. We started this thinking about how we can describe identity networks in a straightforward way, establish sort of a common language, and provide a consistent way to evaluate the needs of all of the identity network users. I'm going to quickly walk through a few key concepts. I know we're running short on time, so I might skip over a little bit and not go into a ton of detail. The framework we developed is included in the URL at the bottom, so anybody that wants to dive deeper can go into that. But I thought this might be useful for relying parties, in particular, who are considering the mDL ecosystem. So we've chosen mDL as our ecosystem, and we can think about each of the layers in that context. For connections, it's pretty automatic and straightforward. When we're using the ISO standard, it helps define how issuers, holders, verifiers can all participate in the ecosystem and discover each other in transactions. For communications, this is about the connecting interaction modes and the way that stakeholders communicate with each other. For credentials, it's about really the transferring. Again, it's based on the ISO standard. It could be just one attribute, it could be a combination, proof request or photo, et cetera. And for certifications, there are mechanisms in place to strongly verify the authenticity, but some of the process around establishment is still being defined, and I think, as David mentioned earlier, that'll be covered in a future webinar, so make sure you come back for that next session. Next slide. So we often focus on the technology aspects. I just wanted to point out there are lots of sort of requirements to think about, more than just technology. It's important to consider the legal, business, technical. These should really apply in one way or another to every type of identity network. But the most important thing to consider here is that in order to work and be effective, we really need to consider the needs of all users and sort of how these requirements relate to the user, the relying party, as well as the issuer of the mDL. You can go to the next slide. So beyond those basic requirements, there's a few other factors that we think are key in considering participating in an identity network. So keeping all of these things in mind, the layers, the requirements, these other factors around utility, trust, and privacy, we can jump specifically into what you consider when thinking about participating in the mDL ecosystem or implementing your specific mDL use case. So next slide. And as David mentioned earlier, the Alliance mDL Working Group created a template to help relying parties analyze their own use cases. The template provides sort of a common starting place. It's mainly based on content from the mDL white paper that was published by the Alliance, and it's helpful to sort of put this all in one place as a fillable form. We'll get to an example of that on the next slide, but basically it contains, sorry, come back for 1 second. It contains a way to think through how you want to set up a use case, which interaction modes would be relevant. In day one, that's really limited to something similar to today, where it's only face-to-face transactions. And in day two, we can see how this could apply for new workflows and begin having transactions from a distance. It also considers what data is required for that use case, what privacy and consent mechanisms should be considered, who needs to be involved in the transaction, and lastly, one of the most important things is the value proposition for all the stakeholders. This is especially important because, as David touched on briefly earlier in the opening, the real revolution in service delivery is trust at a distance. If the way the mDLs are implemented only focuses on those attended interaction modes, even after day two, use cases that aren't possible today with physical IDs will be severely limited and won't be very different from today. So the value proposition becomes a more difficult sell. So I think that section in particular, thinking through the interaction modes, is really key and important for relying parties as you think about your use cases and how you might use mDLs. All right, now next slide. Thank you, Kathy. So here's an example of the template filled out. It walks through a use case for access to federal buildings. So this just gives you a good feel of what it would look like to complete the template. As an example, it shows a multi-step interaction where you need to register to attend the meeting ahead of time, and then you check in when you arrive. There may not always be a case where this is multi-step interaction. You could only have one interaction envisioned, but it's completely up to you. So if you're an Alliance member, this is available now as an internal document, but I understand it will also be available publicly in the near future. as a reference for anyone who wants to use it.